Right, my name's, is that too loud? Yeah, okay. My name's Doug Cryer, and I'm director of Telekinetix, which is a database development company in the UK. Before I start, how many people have worked with REST? Okay, so most of you have actually experienced REST already. Okay, so that kind of gives me a feel for. So if you're looking for a really polished performance, then you're in the wrong room. You need to go to one else. So I'm just going to blunder my way through this. And what this is about is I'm going to do two parts of the presentation. The first one is communicating to a kind of a generic REST service to utilize the facilities in that. And the second part is going to be about actually publishing REST from 4D. And so it's my implementation of that. Okay, so the first one, we are going to look at a product called Capsule. Now, I don't know if you've heard of, anybody heard of Capsule? Hands up? No? Okay. So Capsule is a web-based CRM system. They got an interesting little model. They basically treat contacts and organizations as parties. Okay, so it's party town. And there's documentation online that anybody could go away and do and write their own REST implementation to it. So I've chosen to use it as a very, very short example of communicating to a REST service. How I've done this is I've actually decided that the main part of the communication is easier done through a plugin, sorry, a component, rather than writing all of the code into the database, because I've got 150 customers that use the solution, but only 5 of them are going to use Capsule integration. So I'm using a component and I'm calling it through execute method so that I can drop it out, drop it in with no problems. So this is the component. The component, I must say, every single thing that you see in the presentation in relation to the documentation, the Capsule component, and the database that I'm demonstrating with the REST, it's all on the pen drive. Okay, so in this particular instance, sorry. Right, okay. Okay, so this is a very simple method, and it's calling one of, this is doing it from within the component. So obviously in yours, you've got the compiled component and the uncompiled component. So these are a lot of the calls within the Capsule API. It's not all of them, and they need, you know, by no means this is a finished product. This is for you to take and do what you like with it. You may never use Capsule. But by doing it this way, I can insulate the user from some of the peculiarities of the actual API itself. Because some calls seem to bring back arrays of data. Some GET calls bring back a one record. So what I've decided is to make it the same every time. So I'm bringing back an array of data when it's a GET call. I'm expecting it to send in an object when I'm doing a put call. Okay? So in this test that I've got up here, I'm basically declaring an object array of parties, and I'm calling through. If I just trace into that bit, because you probably want to see the bit when it goes in. And if we go into this, brilliant. Not good. Okay. So I'm going to let you explore that yourself. I'm just going to go through this. One time and just come back out the other side. So I'm setting all, so the essential thing is, what REST is basically HTTP calls. So we're using all language, there's nothing special in here, it's all 4D language elements. I need to resize that, shouldn't have stepped into this. Now Capsule has a weird way of, it doesn't give you any information on the response about how many records it's returned. So in this particular instance, I've implemented a way of saying, have I got more? And then outside, if I've got more, I would then sit this in a loop to actually bring back more records. And I'll show you that in the implementation side in a moment. So what it's brought back is parties. And in my parties, I've got all of the attributes of that party. It's brought back it's brought back page 1 because I haven't specified it, and it's brought back 100 records because that's Capsule's default. So I can run that again, and I can basically, if I pass it a query object now, there's limited amounts of things you can put in a query object for Capsule, but if I pass it a query object when I rerun it, in this instance, what I'm doing is saying, bring me back the second page. So there's my query object, and I've told it, bring me back page 2, and bring me back 100 records. Okay, so you basically page through all the different records in that way. Right, so I'm going to skip over to the other demo. I'll probably quit this one for the time being. I might have to come back. And what I've done here, I've created a method that goes to my Capsule database and pulls back all of the data and populates my database in the demo. So what it's doing is I'm executing a public method to say set the keys in the component. I'm then setting read write on the data that I'm actually going to write to. I'm telling it I want all of the person types, and then I'm getting all of the parties that are people. I'm then later getting all of the organization records, because remember I said parties in Capsule are both organizations and contacts. And then I'm looping through, and I'm using dot notation in this particular instance, but you could use the ob set get to actually fill that data back in the database. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. As I said, this is all on the demo. So if I run this, I didn't but stop at the end, so I don't know when it's run. But basically it deletes all the data in database and then recreates it, and I've got all the data. I've got 380 records in here. I did have more because I was looping through it 4 times and creating it lots of times. So I've got 380 records, and that's going to now form the basis of the data I'm going to demonstrate the rest in 4D. Now, before I go ahead and do that, I'm going to talk about other things, other projects that we've looked at. How do you close that? So as well as Capsule, we've also worked on, I've also worked on a few that are a little bit more mainstream. So has anybody ever heard of BigCommerce? No? You don't do selling online or anything like that? No? Okay. Has anybody ever heard of Shopify? Okay. So, so they all have APIs, and so many things now have APIs that are RESTful APIs, that this is really just the best way to communicate to any system from 4D, because it's so easy from 4D. 4D just loves REST APIs. So this is an example of Shopify's API. So if you know it, you'll know that it's got pretty good documentation. BigCommerce, which is another e-commerce system, it's more for the enterprise e-commerce stuff. Its documentation is a little bit difficult to use, and it's stuck between two versions of their API. You have to use one version for some things and another version for other things. So it can get a little bit frustrating. And what I've done is I've done about 5 or 6 of these now, and that's then informed me how I wanted to build the REST within the actual database within 4D. So what I've ended up with, this is an example of how do I maximize it so it's just right. Okay. No, that's not. Oh, oh, of course, zoom out. That's why I couldn't do it. Right. Right. So this, that was, I went forward. Right. So this is an example of a project that we've put the REST API into. This is a database for the clothing industry, hence all the links to all the e-commerce sites. And as you can see, there are quite a few calls that we built that are all REST calls. For the actual demo, I've basically done a simplified version. So I've created a simple introduction, a company call, a contact call, and a change call, and there's a user call, but I'm not really doing anything with that today. So I'm going to walk through the different component parts of the REST API as it is in the documentation, because I think this is from working with 5 or 6 different REST APIs, this is how I've implemented it within 4D. So obviously authentication, and then on the get response details, I looked at a lot of them and I thought, well, what do you need? You need to be able to tell it which page you're dealing with. You need to know how many pages it's returned. You need to know the records that have been sent and the records that were found. Okay, so you've got an overall picture of what it does. So that comes back in this area here. I don't know if you can see that on the right. So you get a response header that is basically page count, records sent, records found, and then the body of the request response. Okay? So what does that look like in practice? If you actually ran one of those, what would you get? So here I've got I'll just take that out for the time being. Here's a response for the company table. So that's my 380, but obviously that's just page 1 of 4 because I'm building back, I'm asking it for that many per record. So if I go tell it page 2, I go to page 2, and so on, so I can iterate through. I can also, if I go back to the documentation, you'll see I can specify the page size. So I could go back and I could say page size 1,000, and then it would bring all those 380 back in one lot. Now I've limited my API, I've specified that the max you can bring back is 1,000. So even if you are specified 2,000 in here, it will only bring back 1,000 at a time. So it's brought back all 380 in one page, simples. Okay, I had a little bit of code that I stuck on the end of that. So going back, I'm working my way through the documentation. So you can also specify count. So instead of actually saying anything, you just say /count, and it will bring back only a count of the records for the set you've requested. Filtering. So this would be where you actually want to bring back a resource, but you want to filter, simple filtering on a particular value in there. So in this particular instance, I'm going to stick my little bit that I had on there, and I'm going to find any companies that begin with Tele. And then that will bring back those companies. Have I done something wrong? Yes, I have done something wrong. I've not put that as, that's what happens with copy and paste. Right. So it's brought back two companies that start with Tele, and they are then displayed there. So you can start to see, I've tried to think of everything. I'm sure there'll be things that you want to add to your REST thing that I'm not dealing with. But that's your filtering. And you can add multiple filters and put them in. But they're all URL filters. So you can obviously, you're going to go, well, what about if I want to do a complex query? Well, I'm getting to that. So the next part is ordering. So you also might want to specify a sort order for that. So you would simply specify that you, within there, you would go, what is it, order underscore by, and then specify the fields that you want to order by. And you can you read that? So that, then you'd use the greater than. So it's kind of very 4D-ish way of doing things. Fields. So you also sometimes don't want to bring back all the fields from your resource. So you can specify by saying fields and then a comma-separated list of the fields you want to bring back. I think I have a setup of that. So in this particular one, if I have fields equals company name, it brings back all the records 100 pages at a time, and it only brings back the two fields. It does also bring back a sub-resource in this instance, because in my API I've specified I want to have contacts included in the company if there are any. So what you're seeing here is the ID. That's a mandatory field. It will return that even if you don't ask it to. The company name and the contact, and that's obviously an array of contact objects. You'll notice that in this particular one, because I've decided to keep the capsule links in my details field, which is just an object, which of course, because it's an object, it goes sub-resource. If I took off that, I get back to the normal where I've got all the fields. There's a sub-resource, there's a details field on company, and there's a details field on contacts. Right, so that's fields. There's another one, I don't think it's on there. Okay, as well as fields, I've also got a concept of exclude. I don't think I've got it on there. So basically, if I go, that's from a different resource. So if I do this and I type in $exclude equals, and I go company name, then it will bring everything back except company name. Now, because of my particular database that I've got a lot of fields named the same. So I thought, well, actually, it'd be nice if you actually could just remove anything that had started with address. So you can just wildcard the field names as well to exclude those or to include those when you're doing fields or exclude. So, query object. Query objects is a little bit more complex, and I can't demonstrate it through a web page because, and this is where I hit a major stumbling block in my understanding of the REST model. Apparently, and half of you will probably know this, when you do a post, you don't get the URL string, and when you do a get, a lot of things, a lot of browsers and UI modules in the web actually don't send the body. They either convert it to a URL string or they just throw it away and only send the URL. So this presented me with a bit of a problem, because how do you do a get but with a body to give it a really complex query? So I ended up doing something I didn't want to do, but so this is where we get into the this is my get demo. So in this case, I'm doing a what have I done? Sorry? Oh, I know what the problem is. I changed the port. That was not clever. Okay, so I'm creating myself a problem here. And I've hard coded it, so right. So get simple at the moment is just getting a simple request. Get query is running a simple query. These are all going to error, aren't they? So let's change them all. I'll have to look at this anyway. So. Get all is going to run through and do that looping thing. So, but with mine, I'm paging through. I know how many pages I've got to do, and it'll bring all back 380, depending on whether I have to. I think this is bringing it back 10 or 20 at a time, so it's going to take a little longer. Post query is my solution to being able to deal with the fact that you can't send a body with a get. So let me show you that in all these in practice. So we have this, which is a very simple very simple example of doing a call and bringing back a company with Telekinetix. We did that in the web. We can do that easily. The get query is where it gets interesting, because what we're doing here is we're passing it a body. But we're building that body I've done it in 2 lines. So I've got 2 lines of the query. One is looking for companies that start with Telekinetix, Telek, and then I'm passing it a conjunction and saying, or the company is equal to test. So again, this is very 4D-like in the way that I'm approaching it. In this one, I've done it by dot notation, and in this one, I've done it the old style way. But it's still the same because it's going into the same object. I'm then calling it and getting the response, which is the records that meet those requirements. Any questions about that? Here I'm using get with a body because as far as 4D is concerned, it doesn't care. And so from my point of view, when I started this, I used it, I was writing a desktop application and I wanted a better way than SOAP, or a newer way of SOAP, than doing the downloading of the data, the synchronization of the data. So I chose to use REST and test out what I'd built. I then started doing web stuff and realized that you couldn't do it, that it just doesn't work. So yes. Yes, yeah. At the moment, I'm actually making a web call to myself. Yeah.
And your REST server basically running something a loop inside that.
No, my REST server is just the web server.
Okay, and you've got a method in HTTP request that responds to
Yeah, I have to go back into small mode because I can't see this at the moment. So if we go to the on-web connection is basically, there's a few other things going on there, but essentially it's wrapping into this API REST method. Yeah. So that API REST method is what's doing the heavy lifting. And this is where I've had to do this fiddle with, if it's a post but I've specified /query, then I know I actually want to get, but it's a query post. Okay? And that's how I get over the issue of having a body with a thing that brings me back data for a get. So as you can see here, I've specified, I'm going into the get thing because I've said it's a post get, and I'm running the code for the REST get company and running that through. So I'm going to go into this briefly, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it. Again, you're not going to be able to see that very well, are you? Command plus. Ah. No, that's not working for me. Okay. No, that one. Okay. Okay. Right. Okay, that's better, isn't it? Right. So what I'm doing here is this is me building my REST request. Now you could I've kind of broken it down to little different bits, but you could go further than I've gone. So I'm using the template function within 4D. So when you do so in here, I'm basically specifying all of for each table, I'm specifying all the fields I actually want to expose in the way I want to expose them. Because I'm dealing with some pretty ugly databases a lot of the time, okay? I've come to them, they've been running for 10 years, I've come to them, be asked to put a REST interface on it, and I'm going, I can't expose those fields. So there is at the bottom of this a generic expose whatever it is if you haven't specified it. But I really need to think about how it's going to be presented to your end users of the REST. And it's going to be web developers, and you don't want it to be ugly. You want it to be pretty. You want the names to be the kind of things that they'd expect to see in a REST call, and make it more logical. It might be great for your business to have it called that, but externally you want to think about it differently. So that's why I'm using the template, and I'm basically setting up a template for each of the tables. Also allows you to cut out stuff you don't want to see. The only way that the generic one is cutting stuff out is saying if it's not visible, I think I'm cutting it out, or you know, so you need to think about that. So you might want your ID as lowercase, or whatever it is you're going to make these. So that basically sets up what is returned based on a pointer to the table that I'm dealing with. This method is quite heavy, and I'm not going to have time to go into it, but it's basically the thing that's doing all the heavy lifting with the complex queries. There's nothing complex about it, but if I go through it, I'll be here for another 20 minutes. And I've implemented query selection, which the way it works, you would have to do that with query, but it allows you to break it down as you're doing it. I've also implemented query with array, because when I was using it, I realized, do you know what? There's a lot of times I actually I just want to throw an array at it and bring it back, rather than build a query that has 100 lines of code. Yeah, because I'm trying to bring back a series of something, and that starts to break some of the limits of how much data you can send anyway when you get into stuff like that. So query with array, and also query selection with array. But the query selection ones have to be used in conjunction with query, and it does say this in the documentation. So that's the build query and the filters, and then once I've got the filters apply after the query in my rules. So you query, and then if there's additional filters, it filters that. I'm then saying build the sort. I'm then picking up the exclude fields. And this is how I'm specifying that that's a mandatory field. So I can put a comma-separated list of fields that I always want to return for that particular REST call. And then at the end, I'm simply using standard things like, again, it's all standard 4D code, create selection for array, parse array, and such like. And then I'm doing a sub-resource in this particular instance, which is why I showed you this one. So I want to basically parse these in as sub-resource under company. So there is a way you could add to it, say, exclude the sub-resource, and then it would pick that up. But I haven't done that in this particular instance. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my form. So here's my post query working, or not working. Did that? Yeah, it did work. Yeah. Right. Okay. So that's the meat and bones of it. How are we doing for time? Right. Okay. So here's another one that I've done just in the web browser. This is from a live system that well, not live, it's a development system back at home. So this is doing it, in this particular case, this is pulling the data from a system in the UK and bringing it back. So you can see it's not slow. I mean, obviously I'm showing it locally, but it's actually incredibly fast. I was surprised how fast 4D web server can bring back REST requests. And obviously you can reduce the load by only specifying the fields you want to bring back. But it's right. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to log in. And so this is now, so what I wanted to do is I wanted to get it tested. Because obviously, I could give this to people who write websites, but I wanted to know if it worked. So we've been building a separate application, which is just like a little bit of, that we've been playing around with the REST interface inside, what's the environment? So we're using JQX widgets and a little template, and this template website connected to the database is all in the thing as well. So we've got these two tables here. We've got every request that's going to the database is going as a REST query and bringing the data back. So we've got change requests, and we're doing slightly more complicated things here. We're using all of this, and JQ widgets is a good one for creating a UI. We're not UI specialists, but we threw this together pretty quickly. And then we said, okay, well, we want to demonstrate the query in a web page. So we want to do something like company name is equal to T wildcard. And so what you can see here is essentially the 4D query editor, only maybe a little better. Okay, so and we'll have address contains street. And then it brings that back. And you know that obviously we can modify that. We've written something to save it to a file. Tom did all this bit, by the way. He's the clever one on the web. So we've written something to save it to file. We've written something so if you're in the same context, it kind of caches it in that particular in an object in the page, so you can bring it back. Okay, and we've done the same thing for queries, adding new. These are all just static. They're just literally doing a simple query. Right, how am I doing for time? Okay, I got a lot more time than I thought, so I could actually show you some of the code. I'm not going to show you the web code because I don't particularly understand it. Right, did I show you the post query? Right. Okay. Has anybody got any questions before I go on? Then maybe that'll direct the last few minutes. Yeah. Well, that really depends on your architecture. What we're doing in ours is we're using the web server on the server. Okay? But obviously, for scalability, you might be using the web server on client, but it doesn't make any difference because it's just an endpoint. Obviously, it makes a difference for the client then has to communicate to the server. So you're not going to get necessarily the performance benefit of directly to the server, but you'll get the scalability benefit of being able to have multiple web endpoints. Does that answer your question? Yes. In this case, I'm just using the local, but it's the local built in with the developer one. But on our production servers, we're using it on the server itself. Our typical customers range from anything. We've got about 150 customers that are using the iLevel system, and they range from anything like one or two clients, one or two client users, up to about 30 plus. But not much, but nothing about 50 for that system. So other systems I've dealt with are using much more. The code itself, you just have to avoid all the traps of using preemptive. You're using the web server. The web server is preemptive. As long as you haven't done anything silly like using global variables in there to pick up things. Remember, it's not really, it's a REST methodology, but it's actually just the 4D web server. So it can run. Its throughput is quite staggering, especially when you've got it on a machine with lots of memory, and you are, and you've got it running compiled. Yeah, I've been very pleasantly surprised about the throughput of the web server. Now, yeah, actually, I have. If I go and look at product, I don't know if I've got any that have actually got any in there. This is an example of where I've actually done a product is a style within the fashion industry, and then the items are the variants of that style, so they're either color or size. Now, there's an instance where we have. Do we have any pictures in this one? We don't, do we? No. If you have pictures, you basically have to convert them to binary, and you send them out as text in the object, and then the person at the other end has to do the conversion back from that. But we do that in our application, in our application that we're pulling data out through REST. We're actually doing that. We had a few problems with it. Actually, it turned out to be a problem with our network. It actually turned out to be Virgin didn't like these big objects being sent. Yeah, had real problems with it. So, but we switched off the Virgin box. We were on the ADSL, and it's fine. So we know that we've got some potential engineering problems around that, but we're not quite sure. If you've got any solutions around that, then let me know. We tried sending images, because you can send images in REST. Base 64ing is what we've ended up doing though. Well, we're doing pretty big images. I mean, they're not gigabyte. They're not like 20 megabytes, but they're usually around 2. They can be up to 2. They're between 500K to 2 megs. You mean I mean, obviously if it's just gets, you haven't really got that problem. But if you're doing a post from the website, so for instance, I'm going to I'm in here, I'm going new, I'm creating a new change. And I'm saving it. Now, what you'd have to deal with that within the method that does the post and does the save, and how you respond with the message, and then handle the message. The web person would have to handle the message at the other end. So if I go back to the documentation, in here, I'm not doing anything terribly clever on that. I've got the usual HTTP errors, and so that's kind of the methodology to return it. You tell them that you're a teapot or whatever. So you could put your own custom errors in there to inform your developer that something specific has happened. You can also return a more detailed message in a particular scenario. You can return the response from the post to let them know what exactly has gone wrong. In the example, so in the API REST code, I've implemented delete and get, and we were just looking at the put. So each one of these puts for each table is written specifically for that particular function. Now you could write more generically, but I prefer to control that as that's the access point in there. So a put method in here, oops, that's the wrong thing, old style, Control P. We're just picking up here the request body, making sure that if it's got an ID, in our instance, if it's got an ID, it's an update. If it doesn't have an update, it hasn't got an ID, it's an insert. Okay, trying to keep it simple. And then we're then saying what type is it, and we're saying we're either going to create a record or we're going to update a record. And then the next part grabs the template again, validates that you haven't sent it, and will only update those fields that you've sent in that are valid for the template, and then matches the fields in the template that you passed in to the update. So this is fairly simple. You might want to do all sorts of validation to say, well, firstly, you might want to set defaults when things haven't been passed. Other things you might want to do is validate that something has been passed, and if it hasn't, then return an error. Okay? So you then respond by putting in a more specific error and sending that back, and then you might need to manipulate the what we've got here is the responses. So you might need to manipulate the response status and not send back a normal standard response that HTTP will send back if you don't do anything. I hope that was useful for some people. Thank you.